Welcome, everybody. I think because we have so few people that maybe we can just, we'll run the videos and then we'll move to discussant mode, and everybody should feel free to turn on their cameras if you're comfortable doing that, because it's just nice to have a sense of who's in the room. We have 2 papers in this session, which means we have enough time to discuss them properly. And I think it's actually a really interesting juxtaposition, because one is on health and safety and one is on mental health at the project level. And I think we could have a really interesting, after we've talked about each paper on its own terms, have a bit of a discussion about whether approaches to health and safety and approaches to mental health, whether they call for similar or different types of approaches and raise or similar or different issues. So my hope is that we can talk about each paper individually and then maybe have a bit of discussion thinking about the issue, whether the issues which we've raised for one are relevant for the other or not, okay? So we'll start with the first paper.
Good day all, and welcome to the presentation of the pilot study, The Perception of Mental Health in Small to Medium Enterprises in the Welsh Construction Industry. I will begin with a brief introduction to the research, followed by the literature review and methodology, then outline the findings and our conclusions. Our UK private sector is dominated by SMEs, accounting for 99.9% of the business population, with construction being the largest industrial sector in terms of SME numbers. In Wales, we have the largest proportion of SMEs compared to the other home nations, 92.4% compared to 86.7% operating in industry. Mental health poses a significant issue in the UK. 1 in 4 people experience a mental health issue every year. 1 in 4 people. That is a statistic we cannot ignore. In 2019, the UK suicide statistics surged to a 21-year high, following half a decade of decline, with men continuing to account for 3/4 of suicide deaths, and this does not even take into account COVID. The construction industry has also been identified as the 3rd most stressed sector in the UK. If we consider that 82% of our industry is experiencing some form of stress, and there is a reluctance by 40% of our industry whom are unwilling to discuss their mental health, there are clearly barriers we need to overcome. As you would expect, the literature review did identify a range of statistics. The ONS 2019 statistics show that males aged 45 to 49 had the highest suicide rates, and the under 25-year-old suicide rates have generally increased in recent years. Of greater concern is the construction trades are suffering from the highest suicide rate per 100,000, echoing the ONS statistics, and specifically men working in construction are 4 times more likely to commit suicide. 4 times more likely. These suicide rates are symptomatic of construction workers being at higher risk of developing mental health problems. This is especially prevalent amongst those working at smaller companies, as a perfect storm has developed. The combination of stigma and the belief that adequate support would not be provided if mental health issues are raised, creating the silent epidemic. Due to men's inability to discuss or ask for support in the workplace, there is a pervasive culture of machoism. Is there any wonder the suicide rate is 4 times higher than the national average? And none of these statistics take into account the impact of the recent COVID pandemic. SMEs can be slow to react when it comes to offering support in addressing mental health needs, with our HSE emphasising how legislation specifically deals with serious failings in the management of physical safety. Often little consideration is paid to mental health. Yet despite the link between mental health and suicide, work-related suicide is not reportable under RIDDLE. Our industry is an almost perfect example of the difference by which society sees and treats physical and mental health. This culture within industry fosters presentism, a phenomenon where workers continue to attend their workplace despite ill health, indicating an underemphasis on the value of their own well-being. The cost of mental ill health to UK employers is estimated to be between £33 and £42 billion a year. Even with conservative assumptions regarding these costings, the cost of presentism to an SME is huge. This could cause serious financial harm to SMEs, and in an industry that is crippled by a silent mental health epidemic, fueled by pervasive machoism, creating a reluctance to discuss their mental health concerns, there are legal, financial and moral cases for improving our mental health in our industry. As we have shown in the literature review, mental health is a clear and tangible stigma for the construction industry. The secondary data collected was reflective of large companies within the industry and highlighted a gap in the research. SMEs do not get the same representation. The study adopted an interpretive perspective, examining the attitudes held by those responsible for SMEs. For this exploratory study, 9 interviews were conducted, and these were the variables considered valuable when identifying the sample pool. All of the participants managed their own companies within the Welsh domestic construction sector. Of equal importance was a willingness to explore the relationship between employer and employee with regards to mental health. The interviews were conducted with the participants willing to discuss their perception of mental health of their employees and the wider construction industry. Move on to our findings. The literature review demonstrated the stigma of disclosing a mental health condition is still a significant barrier to employees seeking support. The interview responses supported the stigma still widespread within construction, where a man-up culture was still prevalent. All participants agreed that there was a stigma surrounding mental health in this male-dominated industry. One of the responses that particularly stood out was, "In my day, we did not have mental health issues." Fortunately, this wasn't a wide-held view by the rest of the participants and could be symptomatic of a social stereotype generated by outdated views and age. However, other participants identified that machoism was a significant issue with men not to want to be perceived as weak. This viewpoint supports the underreporting of mental health issues amongst SMEs and helps in understanding why male tradesmen and semi-skilled workers pose a higher than average suicide risk. It was suggested this was largely gender-driven, with one participant stating, "Men are not allowed to talk about mental health," and would be embarrassed. This toxic man-up culture and the fear of being seen weak evidenced a negative perception of mental health amongst some of the respondents. The older participant, who was aged 65, had outdated views which were reflective of his generation, whilst the younger age group of 24 to 30-year-olds demonstrated traits of machoism. One participant referred to mental health as a shadowed subject, another identifying a lack of tolerance, referring to the taboos surrounding mental ill health in the workplace. However, attitudes are evolving around SMEs' approach to mental health. A positive change has been identified over the last 3 to 5 years, with half the respondents noting that the industry is becoming more tolerant and accepting of mental health issues. As I have previously highlighted, SMEs have a duty of care to their employees, and this includes their mental as well as physical health. But amongst those interviewed, there was a lack of awareness that their legislative duties related to mental health. There was just one participant who understood their legal duties. Let me just repeat that. 1 out of 9 participants was fully aware of their legal duties in relation to mental health. A number of the participants also raised concerns over their own health and well-being, with one commenting, "I'm able to get statutory sick pay for my employees, but what about me? There's nothing." Another identified, "It's too hard to remove anyone to alleviate the pressure." This again corroborated the presentism phenomenon we discussed earlier. When considering the cost implications of mental health on SMEs, all participants agreed that staff absenteeism has a significant impact on the cost and ability to deliver projects, and all the participants agreed that they have little or no resources in terms of time and money to address mental health issues. In conclusion, this pilot study provided an overview of the perception of mental health within the Welsh SME construction sector. Our findings indicated that despite mental health reporting rates rising, there remains a reluctance within the workplace to openly discuss mental health. In most SMEs, there remains a workplace culture stigmatizing mental health and the discussions around it. The poorest attitudes towards mental health presented as a twofold issue: outdated societal attitudes of the 60 to 69 age bracket and machoism of the 24 to 30-year-old age group. Attitudes and perception are changing, however, but at a slow pace, and there's still barriers we need to overcome: fear of stigma, embarrassment, a preference for self-reliance from employees, and a lack of awareness from SMEs. The study highlighted that there's minimal awareness of the legal duties concerning mental health amongst almost all of the interviewees. This may be down to current legislation placing emphasis on the duty of care towards physical health. Mental health requires parity with physical health. Enveloping mental health under the Health and Safety Work Act 1974 and making work-related mental health issues reportable under RIDDOR would bring the importance of mental health to the forefront. This has the potential to foster a culture of social acceptance and understanding, supporting the current subculture of acceptance beginning to emerge. Poor mental health issues have a significant economic impact on the construction industry, as well as the wider economy. In an SME business, absenteeism and presenteeism pose significant barriers with associated reduction in productivity and an increase to the physical risk on site. Fortunately, SMEs are more agile and adaptable than bigger businesses, and perhaps better placed to provide a more inclusive and supportive work environment. They have a moral and ethical responsibility to help employees by offering them support where necessary. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation on the perception of mental health in small to medium enterprises in the Welsh construction industry. I will now take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mark. I've now put us in discussion mode, so anybody who's happy to turn on their camera, I would invite you to do so, just because it's nice to see who's in the room. I don't see any questions in the chat box, so I'll start with one of my own, and then maybe we can move on. I guess I have a couple. I have a number of questions, but it seems to me your study, the people you interviewed were owners of SMEs, and I wonder if you think that the findings would be different if you had interviewed employees.
My focus was to try and remain on SME owners, because there's a lot of research out there. The research told me that the big companies are reacting to this, which means the employees in the bigger companies do have support. So I wanted to specifically focus on the SME owners to see what they were aware of, what they were doing, what they knew. So my primary focus was on SME owners. I think there would be a very different view if we did look at their employees. It would be an interesting angle to explore. But initially, having worked for SMEs in the past, I wanted to see where they stood as owners, because they're the people with the power to do something.
Actually, Mark, we did some research in Ireland. This is Jim Bradley here from the University of Limerick, and we did a cross-section of both the owner-managers and the operators. And it doesn't matter what level in the company you talk to, whether it's an operator or an owner-manager, the stigma is still there. Maybe even more so down towards the operator level, because they tend not to have, we'll call it, the equipment to deal with the whole issue of mental health. The other thing we found in Ireland is the owner managers are so engrossed in trying to keep their pipeline full with regard to work, that this leads then to issues like, not returning calls to their clients. It leads to a lack of productivity and jumping from job to job. And this leads then to a lot of stress, which is translated down then into the guys who are at the coalface trying to do the work. So it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The worse the job situation is, the higher the stress. The worse job situation becomes, the higher the stress again, So it's kind of like a downward spiral. And we actually looked at a lot of what we'll call micro enterprises, we'll call it Bob and his van, and they tend to be even worse because they have nobody to speak to at all. Not only is it not discussed, the only person they can discuss it with maybe is their wife at home, and that becomes old very quick. So they tend not to talk, and it's a huge problem.
The one thing that I didn't highlight in the presentation that's present in the paper, speaking of Bob and his van, it was I did specifically try and target a Bob and his van to be included in the participant group.
Okay.
And he was the one person that was actually aware of the legislation.
Okay.
Ironically.
Right.
But that, in his own words, that was fueled by his personal experiences in other roles.
Yeah.
Only by chance he was aware of it, and why I wanted to focus on, as you described, in the micro enterprises as well. I interviewed one individual who works on the larger sites, where it's the large commercial sites, and he was aware of campaigns that were taking place, only because he was on these large sites.
Yeah.
But these micro enterprises and these other SMEs generally tended not to be aware because they're not getting exposure.
That's right. Yeah, they don't have a health and safety department or an occupational health department within their organisation who can roll out the projects or the support. They don't know where they are. This was something that came up last week in Seeds actually as well, with regard to how can we make it more accessible for the micro enterprises. Should we have it available maybe in their supply centres where they tend to congregate, as opposed to send it to the owner manager who probably doesn't have the time to disseminate it down through the group. It's a huge problem.
I don't know if you came across in your reach that there is a mountain of help actually physically available.
Yeah, there is.
it was quite astonishing when I actually looked into that side of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I stayed away from causation and all of that, what's actually causing the issues.
Yeah.
But it was inevitable. The one that I stumbled across inevitably was payment. 90% of the issues around this, for the SME owners, their stress, etc., was payment. But that's just, like I said, I digress slightly there in terms of causation, but it was quite scary, the number of SME owners that basically almost felt like they didn't have the time to address this issue.
Yeah.
Even though they were in their workforce.
Yeah,
I think Andrea and Ingrid both have a question or an observation to make about the difference between large firms and SMEs. Andrea, do you want to?
Okay. Yeah, I think these SMEs do have less resources to tackle that problem, but they have a better rate of supervisor to worker, like in Australia that I observed that small projects, like housing projects, the ratio is 2 workers, 1 supervisor. But in the mega project, it was 40 workers, 1 supervisor. So that's less personalized. And in a large organizations, it's more easily depersonalized. And Mark, you interviewed as small as very small companies that are owners, right? So that's one owner. His companion is only a van. But I think they should have the socialization through these charity and industry trade unions. I think that's where they got socialization support. And the positive side is that they have more autonomy. They can decide how they work. So this is, I mean, if the supervisor manage the process, that could be a huge source of pressure, job pressure. But at SMEs, they have a lot more autonomy and they are more personalized.
They do, but unfortunately, the general feeling that I got from the SMEs is they don't have the time to invest. And also there's that stigma surrounding mental health as a topic. Yeah. Even though the observation is spot on, they are more personalized. Nobody wants to talk about it.
That's right.
The elephant in the room.
And I do agree that payment is really an issue for SME, also for subcontractors. Right? They are bullied by the main contractors.
Yeah.
Paul, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of points already well mentioned and also quite well known in the literature. So the idea is that having high stress is not necessarily a bad thing if you feel like you have autonomy and you can control. But I think in the cases of not being paid, maybe they don't feel like they are under control, they are within their control. And so my question or comment would be, maybe we need some sort of fine granularity to figure out what type of SMEs and where they position themselves within the value chain. Because I think depending on where they are in the value chain, maybe you have more or less control. And the other thing which Andrea mentioned about socialization, I think is really important. But I think we should also connect the quantitative with the qualitative. Because if your ratio is 1:2, that could be seen as a good thing. But if you have a micromanager who is the supervisor, having 2 is actually it's going to be a huge problem because you feel like you're always being controlled. And the irony is if you are in a ratio of 40, maybe you actually have more autonomy.
Yeah, more visible.
I would kind of really look at the kind of qualitative aspects of that also.
I mean, and just sort of building on that idea that we could actually go beyond the generalizations, which are extremely important in order to lay out the problem. As I was reading the paper, I was wondering whether what it would look like if we started distinguishing between types of mental health problems. And then obviously there's a lot of thinking that has to be done about whether it's the cause of the mental health or the symptom, but I do think at some point mental health isn't one thing, and the way one would address it would vary depending on the person and the type of distress that they were experiencing. So I don't know, Mark, if you want to comment on any of those ideas about further directions for the research.
In fairness, going forward, yes, mental health is a very, very complex issue, types, forms, etc. Identifying the true root cause can be a multifaceted thing. It could be personal pressures, it could be work-related pressures. But again, I try to stay away from that side of it because it is so emotive. I just wanted to look at, right, is there a problem? But I try to also shift my focus away from the larger sites where I know that there is less taboo, where they are pushing the toolbox, and try to focus more on the domestic side, where it's even more hidden. So if we come back to Jim's point about Bob and his van, he might have work-related stress plus other stress factors, so we don't know what. Getting into what finding out the root cause is would be a very, very complex issue, and I think you don't need to bring in, for want of polite description, someone with a professional background in that field to understand it better, because delving into that world is quite complex, and you're getting into people's personal situations, could open up a can of worms, in my personal opinion.
And what about Paul's suggestion that there might be variations depending on the amount of autonomy or that a person has in terms of how they experience stress?
I do think that has a bearing, because people deal with stress in different ways, don't they, in fairness? So the level of autonomy, but I think it's also about the culture that they're in at the time. If you look at the bigger sites where they are trying to push the mental health agenda, maybe there's a culture, they are breaking down those barriers. So yes, the autonomy does help. Then flipping back to the micromanager comment, that person might be micromanaging because they're trying to keep their business afloat.
So we have the knock-on stress effects. All right, what I suggest is why don't we move to the next video and then to the next presentation, and then perhaps we'll have a little bit of time at the end to pull the discussion together. So I'm going to switch back to presentation mode. And hopefully, and we have Fidelis' presentation.
Good day, colleagues. Thank you for watching this video in the 37th annual ARCOM conference, a virtual conference. My name is Fidelis Emuze. The paper I'm presenting.
I'm just going to stop it and start again because I think there's a bit of an echo.
Today is entitled Fortifying Management Control of Health and Safety and Productivity Laws in South Africa Construction. If someone were to ask you this question, can contractors maintain high productivity and safety performance on a project at the same time? There will be different answers to it. That is why this question has been a subject of scholarly work, because of the belief that production pressure may cause adverse safety outcomes. Some scholars perceive that high levels of safety negatively affect productivity. In other words, slow down work. But Simon already said, and I agree with him, the direct influence between productivity and safety is difficult to observe. For example, when work pressure is high, for some of us that work on construction site, it is not common to see SOP change or job hazard analysis change in tandem. So in contrast to the tension view between productivity and safety, and our co-authors provide an alternative explanation using the production and protection logic. In the protection logic, they intimated us that construction workers will protect their interests by remaining safe as much as possible. That's logically what we expect from them. And in the production logic, employers on their own will show a positive disposition or attitude towards safety when workers are motivated and they improve productivity. So in analyzing these two logic, Simon says that safety can boost high productivity and production can also motivate safer work. In other words, we have a paradox where we are talking about the tension between production and safety. And when you have the paradox theory, you will note that interrelated elements, they often look logical when viewed separately, but inconsistent when we put them side by side. So choosing one before the other will not resolve detention because they are connected. So prioritizing, for example, production at the expense of safety will inevitably result in an increased need for the other, and it will intensify detention. So contractors must strive for both production and safety at the same time on projects. So what is our question that gave rise to this study I presented this morning? How do unsafe health and safety practices influence loss of productivity in construction is what we looked at honors level study. And the purpose was to establish the relationship between health and safety practice and loss of productivity to propose interventions that can break this gap. Quickly, our methodology follows an inductive approach. We conducted face-to-face interview. The field worker, the student did that in 2 provinces, and of course, 22 people in construction on site were interviews. And the interview protocol has 2 kind of questions, closed-ended questions that gave rise to statistical data analysis, descriptively analyzed because the numbers were small. We cannot go into differential statistics, and thematic analysis for the textual data were expedited. This is the profile of the respondent. You have supervisors, managers, etc., people that are educated enough. Some of them have postgraduate degree to answer the question, and majority, 13 of them, have more than 10 years of industry experience. So they can answer these questions, colleagues. Then the first table I want to present that these 2 elements are connected. However, they also said they believe that induction and training is a safeguard against the loss of productivity in terms of if you have H&S problem on site. They confirm that H&S audit saves life and time as hazard and risk. You will know them before it is too late. So wrong H&S practices can reduce production rate because of possibility of injuries and cost to the company. Now, in terms of the discussion, we are brought into HSE model, which some of us may be familiar with. I explained it better in the paper, which addresses the need to reduce the hazard burden on site. Figure 1 shows that in an environment where loss of productivity may occur due to health and safety lapses. So having no arms begin with converting uncontrolled hazard into controlled risk through safety management system. And we must pay attention to the 3 levels: management arrangement, risk control system, and workplace precaution. They are very, very important, and they eventually lead to positive health and safety culture, which will help us control hazard and risk and lead to no injuries, no harm, essentially. So this modified figure from Makino 2014 that I did myself it indicates that we need to deploy management control with caution. All right, and to do that, we identify the risk in the works on site. We set measurable standard for them. We also set standard for reporting. We measure against those standards, evaluate conformity, and when we see deviation, we correct it, then we comment no harm on site. So in conclusion, this paper suggests that it is necessary for us to fortify management function that controls productivity at HNS. But we must do it with care, because reinforcing management control should never be excessive, so that we avoid unintended consequences that can lead to project failure. So the result that we have shared provide a reason to strengthen the three management arrangement, risk control, etc., and precautions. And of course, the 7 steps that I've outlined in figure 2 are just to look at the paper if you are keen on it. So doing so will limit loss of productivity due to increased hazard burden and uncontrolled risk on site. When adequate procedures and supervisions are lacking or not used, loss of productivity is likely. We need to be mindful of it. That is why management should devise and deploy a risk control system on site. I want to thank everyone for listening. We have a good conference, and God bless you.
Okay. Sorry, I just need to Can people hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was very informative. Should we start about whether there's any questions? Let's see, trying to just change the screen to the discussion mode.
Yeah. Let's see. Is that
there we go. That's a little bit better. Okay, I'll start with a very generic, general question. In a lot of construction management, there's a pretty widespread criticism of management systems. We all have to. We know that we need them and we can't live without them. But there's also a sense that they're never implemented exactly the way they promised to be implemented, or they don't do what it says on the box. And I'm wondering if you might want to comment on how one would take that into account in the analysis that you've done or the approach that you've suggested.
Thank you, Libby. I think you are spot on. We really, just as in one of the presentations I've seen today, is really will you find work as imagined as work as done. The same applies to management systems. You can design it, it's very, very good on paper, but when it comes to implementation on site, especially in this part of the world, where we also have SMEs running the show, their majority, at least in South Africa, management systems are not often implemented properly. Hence, why we were mentioning that there's a need to improve the control mechanism. But we are not really referring to micromanaging individuals. SMEs, an average SME in South Africa, you have a company within 5 and 20 people, we refer them as SMEs. So oftentimes you have issues that has to do with payments, delays that leads to lack of resources, and if health and safety is not taken into cognizance at the tendering process, you see oftentimes that the management control that safety requires of the project takes the back burner.
Okay, thanks. Paul, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I saw actually quite a number of comments. I think Royu has.
No, I thought you had raised your hand as well, but go ahead, Royu.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you, Roy.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I saw your figure 1. First, thank you for your presentation. I see your figure 1, the control mechanism that you mentioned, the positive safety culture. So I'm just aware that so many discussions about the similarities or differences between the safety climate and the safety culture. One is a video from Lisa Sondiho from Australia, So in your mechanism, would you consider also embedding both safety climate and the safety culture, like in figure 1? So because I feel it should be embedded in both rather than towards safety culture when you're talking about the balance between the productivity and the safety performance.
I hear what you're saying, and I'm familiar with the work of Riza and Professor Zhu as well. But when you look at the figure, we were really referring to safety culture, not safety climate. All right. And if you look at the document, the HSE document, it talks about the attributes and what is expected of that positive safety culture, because it will help you to have less hazard and less risk on site. So not the climate at its way. We're referring to the culture. Let me use the layman definition. How we do things on this construction site. All right. So that's what we're referring to in that particular context. But I know why you're asking this question. Try to forget our joint research project about safety climate.
Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to.
And then Jim.
I wanted to make this. Can you hear me? Yeah. I wanted to make this comment earlier on because I see that relationship also with Mark's paper. There is often a kind of tendency to think that management should step in or the owner should step in. And then I'm also thinking that those who manage might not necessarily be the ones who do the work. And I am mindful also of rather seminal studies from the Tavistock Institute in mining, Triss and Bamford. This was also what gave rise to now our understanding of social technical systems. What they found when they were studying the mines, when they introduced a new technology, the new technology was, of course, intended to increase productivity, efficiency. But what they also realized in their analysis is that it also changed the relationship between the people who were working, so that actually the way they were organizing themselves in a team, the way they were communicating, sometimes the technology took that away. So I guess my question is, for Fidelis, I think that there are limits to what management can do, especially management whose plans are detached away from the first-hand experience. And also with Mark, I also think that companies are limited in what they can do if, for example, boys are conditioned not to cry when they were even born. So, so the idea that the problem is only existing because they are in the confines of construction, maybe that's something that I don't have an answer, but maybe this is a question that's worth pondering upon.
In fairness to answer the boys don't cry statement, there has been a lot of campaigns within industry to break down that particular barrier, and agreed, mental health is not an industry alone issue, it is a wider societal problem. And the macho is the pervasive narcissism does not stop the moment they leave their job. It's throughout the society as we know it. But I just feel with the SME front, they're not doing enough. There's things they can do for free, apart from time element alone, that they can also take up a little bit of responsibility, not so much micromanage their staff, but just offer that support. One of the SMEs that I worked with or interviewed, he was literally 1,000 miles in front of everybody else. He was there for his staff. And he said, selfishly, at the end of the day, it's my business that's on the line if I don't look after them.
Yeah.
So maybe his motivators were slightly askew, but he was still doing the morally right thing.
Yeah. That was the point I was going to make as well about the whole area of leadership. I think when we put management systems into a company, we're doing safety to the people as opposed to doing safety with the people, and this whole thing about even the interventions from a mental health point of view that are put in place, the people who are the recipients or the people who have to, I suppose, work within it aren't always involved in the design. They aren't always, involved in the discussions around what should be done. And it's often the same in safety. So you put a management system in, it becomes a tick box exercise, and people then feel, okay, I have no opportunity for giving feedback. I have no permission to maybe suggest a way it could work on our site, as opposed to this generalized safety management system that has been sort of dumped down on us to manage us as opposed to involve us. And I think, if you look at safety, it's exceptionally involving. It's about everybody on site. It's about yourself. And I think if the leadership isn't there to maybe give people permission and give people or facilitate people in getting involved, A management system is basically a big file that sits on a shelf and that we pull it out when the auditors come in and say, look, here's our safety system, as opposed to walking down the site and saying, this is our safety system in action. You know what I think?
I think bringing it back, sorry, Jim, two ways you can look at this. First of all, with what you said there's a lack of empowerment on for the people on the ground.
Yeah.
They need to be empowered to have a voice.
Yes.
And flipping it slightly back to mental health, if you put it into context, as I'm sure you're aware, we've had the Health and Safety Work Act since 1974. So what are we, nearly 50 years into that? And still a bone of contention. Comparatively compared to mental health, that's only been at the forefront for, relatively speaking, in the last 5 to 10 years in wider society. The taboo would start. So if you compare the two subjects, mental health by comparison to health and safety is almost in its infancy.
Yeah.
And we've still got major issues with health and safety. People, you can't take out the human factor of, excuse my bluntness, but stupidity, because you'll always get that.
Yeah.
Darwin will take over, but we've come a long way since 1974. It's funny enough, I was just looking at stats before this with my students, and the numbers have almost plateaued now.
Yeah.
If I may,
Fidelis and then Paul.
Yeah, I want to bring in what Andre just said, that the owners, especially with SMEs, have more risk. In our context, wherein SMEs are highly likely to fail within the first 3 to 4 years in South Africa. So if they have an hands-on approach to the business that they run, and the business and project are interrelated, then the risk, they really run a huge risk. You know, so Andre may add to what she said, but it's a reality. And of course, we have to balance. That's why I say you don't micromanage. We have to balance the need to empower the workers and the reality of the fact that most SMEs, at least in South Africa, are not construction management graduate or business development graduate. So if you start a company because you need to survive economically, or you are connected to the government, for example, somebody in government, so you have possibility of getting 1 or 2 tenders annually, your motive is different. So if you are not competent to run that business, somebody have to assist you. So I'm going back to what Paul said. The owner may necessarily not mean the person that is managing the business for the SME. Andre, you can comment.
Okay. I just want to add to it. There's we can see two kinds of micromanagement, right? One is that if in a large bureaucracy, then you set up a system, a standardized system, and then there's a middle management. They just literally implement that system, and so that what they expected you to do is not exactly what is effective for your work. So that's the kind of micromanagement that causes burnout. But I think in SMEs that I shouldn't equal that to SME, but there's a second kind of micromanagement is that the manager collaboratively solve the problem with you. So they do look at a micro level of the problem, and you can then the result is that you are flexible in how in the process in response to the situation of the problem.
Paul, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I was just struck by the comment I think Jim mentioned about the tick the box exercise. The wonderful thing of moving from the UK to the Netherlands is that all my prior assumptions have been are kind of challenged. Firstly, when people ride their bicycles, it's only foreigners who wear safety gear. When they are actually constructing, we have a train station and they are constructing the new railway line. They do not have barriers, and if you were stupid enough to fall into it, it's your fault. It's this kind of idea, but actually, accidents are actually not very high in the Netherlands, right? And depending on whether you trust the surveys or not, the Dutch are also one of the happiest people on earth. So
same as Irish.
And so I'm guessing, so I think maybe the question is, what is control? Who controls? I think there's a tendency for us to think management control will sort it out, but maybe we should kind of maybe that gives us a false sense of security. I'm thinking.
I mean, just to add a parallel point, and then we open it up again. I mean, I was reminded in this conversation when I do some research on, when I started doing research on sustainability, I started working on BREEAM, and it's a tick box. I mean, a lot of people don't like BREEAM because it's a tick box exercise and it's an assessment tool and it's really formal. But what a lot of the industry people I talked to kept saying is, we just want a level playing field. We're happy to do all sorts of things as long as our competitors do them too. And I wonder how that applies here in terms of who sets the level playing field or how it's set, because that's a different way of thinking about top-down kind of control. You know, what is the level at which, what has to be in place for it to be a reasonable thing for somebody who's under enormous financial and commercial pressures to do, and whether there are ways to make it a more reasonable thing to do or to give them more scopes to develop, to listen and be responsive to these issues amongst their employees. I don't know if that adds something to the conversation, but I'd be interested in people's responses.
Yeah, like
to both points, to Paul's as well.
The whole aspect of being reasonably practicable has to come in as well. You know, I think if you look at some of the safety systems that are designed by external consultants, engineers, or whatever, who then stick it into a site, it sounds fantastic on paper. But getting some guy who's in a room working on his own, trying to apply this safety element that has been designed by someone else, it becomes impractical. We had an example of that here in Ireland, where the COVID-19 safe return to work regulations were developed. And we did some research and we found out that they weren't actually practicable in a construction site, and they actually contradicted a lot of what we call traditional health and safety rules that were there. For instance, you're only supposed to have one person working in the room on their own, and yet if you're looking at basic safety, you're not supposed to work on your own, and yet the COVID regulations contradicted that because they were designed in an office by some person who never actually worked on site and had no cognizance of what was required.
And moving back to Paul's point about trusting people.
You have to trust people, yeah.
Mark?
The only other thing you could throw into the mixture is coming back to the SMEs on their own. And a lot of them, I can't remember who said about it, have literally stepped up from their trade environment or their previous role and just taken on this business. So as Fidelis' point out, may not have the correct skills.
Yeah.
Whereas in larger organizations, these people have gone through academia, through university, and have got a basic level of working knowledge. Now, some SME owners are fantastic and have natural business acumen.
Yes.
But in some cases, when we talk about health and safety, for example, it's one thing being told what to do. It's another thing when you've got to go and write those packages or write that safe systems of work. It's a very different skill set from receiving to producing.
Yes.
And there may be a shortfall there in terms of these SME owners not having the appropriate skills. Are we passively then creating more risk?
Yep.
By not allowing these, by these SMEs not having the appropriate skill set through no fault of their own.
Yeah.
But is that a skill set to be aware and attentive to the issues, or a skill set to write protocols?
Well, both, to be fair, because they need to have the skill set to write the protocols, but they also need to understand the law to be able to protect their workers.
Yeah.
I think there's been an issue about immigrant workers that's gone on in the chat. I don't know if anybody wants to raise it in the conversation.
Well, if I can say something, my uncle is a very successful SME owner. He's totally dyslexic. He couldn't read or write until he was in his 50s, and yet he ran a very successful business. But whenever it came to things like implementing legislation around health and safety, he had not got the skill set to do it. He couldn't read the stuff, first of all, and he had major difficulty. And this actually precluded him from I suppose, having an even more successful company. He could design and manufacture any form of pipework, but he couldn't read.
I mean, but I'm quite interested by Paul's example of, which is, you know, in some ways, Paul, you made the example of what's happening in the Netherlands as an example of you moved to a different country with a different cultural context, and you observed that there were other ways of doing it and achieving. But in some ways, the issue of the immigrants also raises the question of how do cultures change, if they need to change or not.
Yeah, and I think there's some research. Was it Dylan Tutt, also from Reading, who looked at these glaziers working, and they were immigrant workers. And everybody says, well, we need to communicate to have health and safety. But the manager's view is, you know, you need to write, you need to talk. But then they realized, Dylan realized that actually these glaziers did not talk, because they used to have to communicate. The glaziers would be working in the third story, and they would actually be using hand signals rather than kind of speech. So I think that, and of course, there's been also a lot on using signage, for example, signage that do not depend on the English language, let's say, and maybe using pictures. And yeah, so maybe we need to also kind of figure out how the medium with which we communicate, I guess.
Yeah.
And in Jean's case, if I follow up, and do you mean that your friend, he cannot write and read, but it didn't mean that he could keep the workers safe, right?
Yeah.
So what stopped his business from more development is the written things.
Yeah. He couldn't apply for tenders because he couldn't structure them. You know, but with regard to communication, we did a project a couple of years ago looking at immigrant workers in London and the problems communicating at a health and safety briefing to them. And we actually used Google Translate on their mobile phones, so they were able to translate in real time. And if there were any instructions that needed to be given to them, they all had mobile phones, they all had Google. So it was a very, very simple technology that we could use to make sure that they understood exactly what was being said in real time. So, you know, there are assistive technologies there that will allow us to communicate well, apart from just having signage and using pictograms.
Okay, is there anybody else who wants to raise a point? I think go ahead.
Okay, I think that the institutions that require people must think in a certain structure and communicate in a certain way that sometimes, in some cases, really stopped people from keeping workers safe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a really interesting conversation on so many levels. I mean, first of all, of course, in terms of our awareness and working through together some of the consequences and implications of both health and safety issues and mental health issues. But there's also been another level of the conversation about how does one approach these and what is the right balance between broader regulations, management protocols, either at the firm level or the organizational level or the project level, and then empowering people to actually articulate and express and have the autonomy over themselves and their behavior, which has been shown, which we think in many cases one is an effective way to address these issues, but two, also gives them more of a feedback loop or engagement with the protocols. And these are sort of challenges that I think are applicable not just in mental health or health and safety, but pose particular challenges, both because they're not seen necessarily as the priority, at least in the short term at a given moment, and they can slip off the agenda, but also because of the severity of the problem and the human cost. So I don't know if we've come up with the perfect solution, but I think we've raised a lot of really important dimensions that need to be taken into account, and I thank everybody for their contribution.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you, Libby. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Andre.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.